You are standing in a museum. Behind a pane of glass, there is a skeleton. It is lying on its side, knees pulled toward the chest, arms folded inward. A placard beside it says something like, Early Human, 12,000 BCE. You look at it for a moment, then you move on. But what if you couldn't move on? What if someone forced you to look closer? Because that skeleton, that quiet, still, carefully arranged skeleton, is not peaceful at all. It is a crime scene. And the story it tells about how that person died is one of the most disturbing things science has ever uncovered. Prehistoric humans did not die gently. They did not drift off in warm beds surrounded by family. They were crushed, stabbed, drowned, burned, and in some cases eaten, not by animals, but by other people. And we know this not from stories or myth. We know it because bones remember everything. Bone is one of the most durable materials in the human body. It survives millennia. And when something violent happens to a bone, a blade, a blunt object, a fire, a fall, it leaves a mark. Forensic bioarchaeologists spend their careers reading those marks the way a detective reads a crime scene. And what they have found buried in caves and riverbeds and mass graves across every continent is a record of prehistoric violence so detailed and so brutal that it forces you to completely rethink what early human life was actually like. One of the oldest and most carefully studied examples comes from a site in Spain called Atapuerca. Deep inside a cave system, researchers led by Juan Luis Arzuaga discovered a pit containing the bones of at least 28 individuals. They are roughly 430,000 years old. That is not a typo. Nearly 500,000 years ago, someone, or a group of someones, carried these bodies to the edge of this pit and dropped them in. Why? That question alone has kept scientists arguing for decades. But here is the part that stops people cold. One of the skulls in that pit, belonging to a young individual now called Cranium 17, had been struck twice in the same spot on the forehead with the same object. 2 blows, same angle, same weapon. That is not an accident. That is not a fall. That is an execution. The wound pattern told researchers that the person was struck from the front, which means they saw it coming, or they were already incapacitated. Either possibility is deeply unsettling, and it raises the question that bioarchaeologists return to again and again: was prehistoric life more violent than we have been told? For a long time, the popular image of prehistoric humans was romantic. Small bands of peaceful hunter-gatherers living in harmony with nature, sharing food, raising children communally. The violence came later, the thinking went, with agriculture, with property, with civilization. Philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau called the early human a noble savage, gentle, uncorrupted. The cruelty came later. The bones say otherwise. In 2016, a team led by José María Bermúdez de Castro published findings from a site in Kenya called Nataruk. On the shore of what was once a lagoon, they found the remains of 27 people: men, women, children, and a woman who was pregnant when she died. They were killed approximately 10,000 years ago. The injuries on these skeletons are extraordinarily specific. Blunt force trauma to the skulls, obsidian blades embedded in the bone, hands bound, based on the position of the wrists, knees, smashed in a way consistent with being held down. This was not a battle between warriors. This was a massacre. A group of people was ambushed, restrained, and systematically killed beside a lagoon. The pregnant woman's fetus was found still positioned within her pelvis. She never escaped. Nataruk is now considered the earliest clear evidence of organized lethal violence between groups of humans. But it is not the only one, not even close. Across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered mass graves from the Neolithic period, roughly 7,000 to 4,500 years ago, that show the same pattern. Not scattered deaths from disease or famine, coordinated, targeted killing. At a site called Asparn-Schletz in Austria, researchers found the remains of at least 67 individuals, mostly adult men and older women. Children and younger women were absent, suggesting they were taken. Every skull showed blunt force trauma. Every body had been left where it fell. No burial, no ceremony, just killing. And then there is the site that changed everything researchers thought they understood about prehistoric conflict: Crow Creek, South Dakota. In 1978, construction workers accidentally uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of nearly 500 people. They had been killed roughly 700 years ago in the 14th century. Their bones had been defleshed, scraped clean with stone tools. Skulls had been scalped. Hands and feet were missing from many of the bodies, possibly as trophies. The wounds were so numerous and so varied that forensic anthropologist P. Willey, who spent years analyzing the site, concluded that this was the aftermath of a raid on an entire village. Men, women, children, elderly, everyone. The survivors, if there were any, had gathered the bones afterward and placed them in a single communal grave. That act of collection, of gathering the dead, is the only tender thing in the entire story. But violence between groups is only one chapter. Some of the most disturbing prehistoric deaths were far more intimate. There is a phenomenon that bioarchaeologists call perimortem trauma, injuries that occurred at or around the moment of death. And in prehistoric remains, these injuries sometimes tell stories that are almost impossible to sit with. A child's skull in Germany dated to around 5,000 years ago, showing repeated blows from a stone tool. An elderly woman in China with a fractured jaw, broken wrists, and cracked ribs, injuries consistent with sustained, repeated blows over time, not a single event. These are not deaths in battle. These are deaths inside a community, inside a family. Cannibalism is another thread that runs through the prehistoric record with uncomfortable frequency. At a site in Herxheim, Germany, archaeologists found the remains of hundreds of people. Their bones had been processed exactly the way animal bones were processed: defleshed, marrow extracted, skull caps shaped into bowls. Researcher Bruno Boulistan spent years studying these remains and concluded that this was not survival cannibalism, not people eating the dead out of desperation during a famine. The evidence suggested ritual, intentional, repeated. Whatever belief system drove it, it was organized and deliberate. What do you do with all of it? What does it mean that your ancestors, not some alien species, but the direct predecessors of every human alive today, were capable of this level of coordinated cruelty? Evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker has argued in his work that violence has actually declined over human history. That despite how it feels to read the news, the proportion of people dying violently is far lower today than it was in history. His analysis of skeletal remains from dozens of prehistoric sites suggests that in some periods and regions, as many as 15% of all deaths were caused by interpersonal violence. 15%. In a modern industrialized nation, that figure is a fraction of 1%. But the more important question is not the statistic. It is what those deaths reveal about the human mind. Because the same brain that planned a massacre at a Kenyan lagoon 10,000 years ago is the brain sitting in your skull right now. The capacity for group loyalty, for tribalism, for the dehumanization of outsiders, all of it is ancient. All of it is wired in. You did not inherit a peaceful nature corrupted by civilization. You inherited an animal shaped by millions of years of competition, cooperation, conflict, and survival. The violence in the prehistoric record is not a malfunction. It is a feature, one that served a purpose once, in a world that no longer exists. And yet the bones also tell another story. At Nadaruk, among the massacre victims, there is evidence that some of the injured had survived previous wounds. Old, healed fractures, signs of care. Someone at some point had tended to them, had kept them alive. The same hands that could pick up a stone and crush a skull could also hold a wounded person through the night. That is the prehistoric human in full. Not noble, not savage, both, at the same time, in the same hand. Tonight, when you feel that flash of anger at someone who wronged you, or that instinct to protect your group against another, or that complicated mix of empathy and indifference toward a stranger, you are not malfunction. You are ancient. You are exactly what 430,000 years of survival built. The skeleton behind the glass is not a warning from the past. It is a mirror.